Well, thank you much, Jennifer, for agreeing to be interviewed. Is it possible to tell us, before we start, just a bit about yourself, your background, and how did you get into this field, really?
Sure. When I was younger, I had a mother who had reading challenges. I don't think she was ever tested until I got into the dyslexia world, and she decided to get tested. But I grew up knowing that she was very smart, but she had a lot of trouble reading. And my I have other family members that also have dyslexia. And so I was always interested in what was going on. They're very smart, but they have trouble reading. When I was in college, a friend of mine was taking, she was early elementary ed. So she was taking a class that required her to go do something out in the community, and they had options they could pick from. And she picked one at this learning center, and she wanted me to go with her. So I went, and it was a whole presentation about dyslexia and about what they did there to work with the kids. And I ended up getting a job there and did lots of training in Lindenwood Bell, which is a big thing
Yeah,
over
yeah,
here.
yeah.
And the more I worked with the kids, the more interested I got in what was going on with them, because they didn't all seem the same. They all had the label of dyslexia, but they didn't all seem to have the same issues exactly, in the way that their reading behavior was different. So I got very interested in the brain, and I went back to graduate school, got a PhD in neuroscience, ended up working in a linguistics lab for quite a long time, and learned a lot about linguistics and the language. Then went back to working with students again, because research is kind of far removed from helping people. So I got back into working with students and ended up working at a place in San Diego called Dyslexia Training Institute. And that's where I got introduced into, well, and I did a lot of OG work over
Mm,
there, and then got introduced to SWI,
yeah.
and I have been working with that ever since.
So Lindenwood Bell is actually in England. They have centres, I
Oh,
suppose. Basically, like a language program, and it's also a vision. Bell did the visualization program. It was, I think,
right.
mainly developed by speech therapists, weren't they?
Yes, the original.
Um,
Yeah, and I actually did my original, they call it LIPS now, I think, but the
so,
original program was called ADD, auditory discrimination in depth, which they had to change because ADD became something else. But it was Charles and Pat Lindemood. One was an SLP. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe he was a psychologist. I'm not sure what he was. Their daughter was Phyllis Lindemood. That's who I learned from originally.
Alton Gillingham is, I suppose, one of the first, or is the first sort of teaching approach. It has a very structured approach. To be fair, Samuel Alton always argued you should never have a prescriptive approach. He always argued you have to base it around the individual. Um, I suppose for an English audience, the equivalent would be Alpha to Omega, which was done by Bevy Hornsby, who was sadly taught me. Bevy trained, I couldn't remember her name like this, did it? Trained with a lady called Margaret Rawson, who was, she worked in a Quaker school for 30 years and did a whole publications about her. I think she's the only person who's ever published such a longitudinal study looking at people's development into adulthood. Um, but she was a speech therapist, so she introduced much more speech and language approaches. And there was
Hmm.
another scheme in England called Hickey, that once again was also influenced by Alton Gillingham. I can't quite remember what the influence was, but there is an equivalent in England to those schemes. It's just a background information, really, so that
Hmm.
uh,
Everybody knows.
yeah. Thank you much for that. Um, you published a new book. Can you please explain to us what is the book about and why did you write it?
So we have created, so my colleague Brad Johnson and I have created a what we call an interactive guide. So it is a way for someone who really wants to understand how the English writing system works to work their way through. That's why it's called interactive guide, to work their way through lessons to kind of understand more about how our writing system works. And it's through the lens of scientific word study. So looking at words and understanding them both through using the scientific method, as well as diving into what's called orthographic linguistics and understanding kind of from an orthography lens, the writing system as a whole, and the fact that it's composed of different parameters, not just the phonology part, the pronunciation part, but also the etymology, which is the history and the origins of words and how they're related, and the morphology, which is the structure, how they're built, and understanding all of those things and how they interact together. There is a framework called SWI, which is structured word inquiry, which is a framework. It's a system of questions that you can use to investigate a word spelling. And that the group of people, the community, the SWI community, is getting a lot larger. And there are a lot of people I'm noticing who are hearing about it and want to learn more about it. And this is kind of like a way to kind of step into that world and kind of start understanding what are the key concepts you have to understand, and how to kind of shift your lens to incorporate those other pieces of the spelling system, the writing system, in your teaching. So it's for anybody who has never heard of this way of looking at things and doesn't really have a background in it. They can kind of step into it, and it's kind of like, hey, let's learn a little bit about this world. Let's learn a little bit about how we can look at these words differently, and learn how to incorporate these different parameters into our understanding of the writing system. There's lots of materials out there, but I feel like this was really for people who are just starting and just want to know a little bit more about the system in a way that is guided. I think we decided to do this guided interactive thing because many of us in the community, I started looking at words this way in 2014. And it took me years to really understand the approach. And I do it with students all the time. So I'm studying words this way all the time. And I think it doesn't have to take that long to get the knowledge, as long as someone is kind of saying, hey, do these exercises, look at these words, right? So that's kind of what it is. It's like, hey, here's a really interesting way to look at things. It's a way to get an insight into the writing system. But here is like a curated set of investigations for you to do so that you can get the same knowledge just by going through the book.
Excellent. So it's actually like an introduction to SWI as well.
Yeah.
We have quite Patos has done quite a lot of SWI courses. Pete has actually run a discussion group as well. And also they've done some physical courses as well as some conference courses and online courses. So there's been quite a few. So there is quite a slowly growing interest, I think, in England around SWI.
Mm-hmm.
With regards to that, would someone need to have done training on SWI to use the book, or could they literally pick the book up and run Monday morning?
Yes, that is how we designed it.
Right.
You can just pick the book up, whether you're a parent or a teacher, and maybe somebody who's never learned anything about SWI. You could pick this book up and get started. And as I mentioned, and I'm happy to give you other resources. And like you said, Pete has come and talked. There's lots of people out there who are putting together courses and workshops and materials, and there's lots of things to use. But I think that, just to be clear, the SWI framework is 4 questions you can use to study a word spelling. If you're starting from scratch, it takes a long time to understand the system from studying words. So this is kind of like a way to speed that process up for the person who A, wants to know how the writing system works, but probably B, wants to help a student understand how the writing system works. And so there are lots of people who just start from day one and go, okay, let's, Pete has a workbook that you can kind of work through. It has some lessons in it. And you can be like, okay, let's just start this together. And you do end up doing, I'm still learning. There are lots of times I study words with students and I learn something new. So we are all still learning, but I think it's a way to kind of speed the process up a little bit so that you kind of know where it's going, and you're building this orthographic linguistics knowledge about how the system works. Because SWI is how to investigate the system. But I think the content knowledge, that takes a while to build up. And so we kind of wanted to do this as a way to help people speed up that process. Because Lord knows professionals in the literacy world don't have a whole lot of time to
No.
spend learning all this extra stuff. So this is a nice way to jump in without knowing anything and get a lot of content knowledge.
How flexible is the material? Because one of the questions that has come up in the past is people want to use the structured question, the question of the sort of SWI approach, where you ask those questions um, in sort of sometimes like a university setting where you're working with students who you think it would help them to grasp the sort of the new technical language, etc., they're coming across. So does your book cover from sort of a primary child, secondary, 16 to 19, and then possibly even someone in a higher education setting? I mean, could someone working in a university or all those stages of education use it?
Yeah, I think it is definitely good for grade school. It has information about the matrices and how to break words into morphemes and kind of word elements and how words are built. It doesn't have as much practice at that higher level because we're planning another book that's going to kind of go into that. So this and just to kind of it kind of is, like I said, it's more about changing the lens, kind of understanding why we have to incorporate these other pieces into studying spelling. And it kind of talks about suffixing changes and high frequency words and why we need to know about etymology. Those are all things that you need to know and probably are going to be working more on in the early years. It, like I said, it does have the section about word elements is about morphology and the matrix and how you can kind of work through all of that. I think if you get to the higher level vocabulary at the, more sophisticated academic at words, you probably run into more understanding about Latin and Greek roots and needing to know a little bit more about that. And that probably is going to be in our second book.
Brilliant. Brilliant. That's excellent. I was going to ask, there's a question I had in my head, so I'm going to have to come back to it. But if that's okay at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're offering a paid webinar. Uh, what will the webinar cover? And would you need to purchase the book to attend the webinar?
So you definitely won't need the book to attend the webinar. I think it would be probably a little bit helpful to have gone through the lessons in the workbook first, but it's definitely not required, and it could certainly be done after. The paid webinar is really going to focus on what we know about the brain and reading and what we know about the writing system and kind of how we can incorporate those things together. Why studying all of the parameters of a word. So not just the phonology and the pronunciation, but also the structure, the morphemic structure, and the etymology. Why that's important to understanding how the whole system works, but especially for students who are struggling in many different ways. So for dyslexic students, a lot of times phonological working memory is kind of an issue, or phonological processing is an issue, and cognitive resources, there might be some issues. So it's a way to understand the system, chunk things together, make connections, connect things to things they already understand. It's focusing on not memorizing, but understanding, right? Understanding a spelling, understanding the system. And so what we know about the brain connects to how we teach this and why it's beneficial. And if you look at the research, there are studies that show understanding the morphology, the morphemic awareness, understanding how words are built, how they're structured with the morphemes. It not only helps all students, but it actually helps those who are struggling, like the poor readers, the most.
Mm.
And so we'll talk a little bit about that, why that is and what's happening there. And you actually do get some gains in phonemic awareness and phonological processing from doing this other way of looking at things and incorporating it at the very beginning. So I think it kind of is going to take all the things that we know in these different areas and bring them all together and explain why it's an important way to look at words when you're working with kids who are struggling with reading and spelling.
Thank you. Can I just go back on, you said help poor readers or students who are
Mhm.
struggling may not be dyslexic. How about students with English as an additional language? So students where their first, their, well, it's a bit complex, but basically the mother tongue may not, so they might be
Yeah.
exposed to a lot of English, but the mother tongue isn't
Yeah.
necessarily in English.
So I'm gonna go through a couple different models that have been presented over the years in terms of
Mm,
how our brain stores information and how it's related in terms of the writing system. And what what we're finding, there's been a model that has the fact that we have orthography, which is the spelling, the written form
mm,
of the word. We have phonology, which is the pronunciation
mm,
and the sounds of the language, and then we have semantics, which is the meaning.
mm,
And they've always known that those nodes are somehow
mm,
related and interacting, and when we're learning how to read, but it's bringing in this morphology as the binding agent. That's the big thing that Pete Bowers and colleagues of his have talked about, is using that morphology piece as the binding agent. And what it ends up doing is not only requiring less cognitive resources and understanding about how the system works, it's giving all of that, but it's also creating a way to not have to rely on that phonology piece,
mm,
because when phonology is impaired or non-existent for
mm,
any reason, you can still bind the other information together. So for a majority of dyslexic students, like I said, phonological working memory, phonological processing, there is an impairment there for most of those kids. And sometimes you'll even see this in spoken language for a lot of them. Vocabulary development may be a little bit behind, that kind of thing. But but if you don't have to rely on that solely on that piece to make these connections, then it's helpful. But then on top of that, you have, like you said, if they're learning English as a second language, they don't have English phonology in place.
mm,
If they are deaf, they don't have English phonology in place. If they have intellectual disability, maybe being able to apply decoding skills is not a thing for them. All of those things you can kind of help get around that impairment by using morphology to bind these other pieces of information together. If you can do the phonology and learn phoneme, grapheme correspondences, that's fantastic. And this is a really good way to do it. But if you can't, it doesn't mean they can't learn how to read.
Thank you. And so, I mean, I taught in Singapore and I've taught in a part of London called Haringey, which has a large numbers of people who are students who are English. They are English, but the mother tongue, a lot of them would not be. A lot of the students would not. They'd go home to another language, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They found the etymological part and the morphology quite. They adapted to it better than most English students have done, in my experience, because they're so used to working in two languages. If you're working, no, I don't speak another language, but from listening to the students, I realize that some, as you said, some of the sound structure in English cannot be translated. So because some of the etymology might had an original meaning, it's moved on. Like the word pulp, for example, to carry, because it's moved on. They don't question it. When you do with English kids, they question you all the time about why has this changed, etc. Because the meaning has slightly changed over the history. It was just quite interesting how quick the EL students picked up on it, really.
And
Um,
it's in English itself is interesting. It's a very unique language
mm,
because it started out, and this is one of the chapters in the, or one of the sections in the guide, it talks about the history of English. And I mean, it's a, brief history of English, but understanding how we got the language we got, that it started out as a Germanic language,
mm,
and we had, some Anglo-Saxon
mm,
languages and the Norse with the Vikings, all of that
mm,
stuff mixing together to give us the Old English. Then we had the French
mm,
dumped in,
mm,
right? And then and the interaction between the English and the French, created huge changes. And then we end up with Middle English. But then also things that have happened since, with the dictionaries and the printing press, and even the American English versus the British English versus the Canadian versus the Australian, right?
mm,
So it's a really rich history that if you're
mm,
not looking at etymology, you miss a lot of that. And instead of making it, I feel like a lot of people want to talk about English spelling as crazy or dumb or
mm,
hard. And instead, if you shift the lens and say, it's really kind of interesting and fascinating, and it has a rich history, and learning to look at it through that lens and understanding these relationships that happen and the histories that are there, it is much more interesting and exciting.
Mm. That makes a bit more sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
You'll be offering a free webinar. What do you think this webinar would cover?
So in the free webinar, I can walk through kind of the investigations in the book and let people know what exactly they're going to be learning, show them kind of what it looks like, what the process looks like, and they can see how they're going to develop their own understanding as they work their way through the book.
Excellent. You mentioned grade level. Were you talking grade level primary or grade levels from all primary and secondary?
Oh, yeah, I was saying grade school. I think these are foundational concepts in this guide. They're things that you would have to know no matter what kinds of words you're studying. So it's a good place to start. You can certainly use the things that are in this book to help learn how to study any word. I think it's going to be more pertinent for probably elementary and middle.
Right.
They're foundational things that you need to know when you get to the higher level vocabulary anyway, but there's not as much practice in at that level.
Brilliant. Thank you. And finally, can I ask you, where would people purchase this book?
So you can find it on Amazon. And it is, like I said, this is the proof copy. So that's why
Mhm.
it has this band, but it's Investigating English Spelling, an interactive guide to understanding how English spelling works.
Brilliant. And thank you very much. And your webinar is on the 14th of January.
That's correct.
So we look forward, or people, I'm sure everyone will look forward to watching it. So thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you.